Okay, so welcome back, everybody, in this Bible study. Um, New book, and this, I believe, is one of the suggestions. Yes, it was one of the suggestions from last time. Okay, when I asked you. So it's not that I always ask for suggestions and come up with different books. All right. So I did take your suggestion. And so one of the books that was suggested from last semester when we met, and I think Judges is such an interesting book. I've read it a couple times myself, but never really studied it. Anybody here, just out of curiosity, like read through Judges? Yeah, totally a weird book. In all honesty, it's a very strange book. The last two, yeah, like last few chapters, the beginning of it, the context of it, like it's all a bit strange. So I'm kind of like excited to work through it with you, because I think context helps us understand, and then context also helps us kind of pull out some of the nuggets that we're hoping to get. Because if you just kind of read the book, you can easily get an impression of like, this is a bit barbaric, right? It's not one of the prettier books that we read in the Bible. So we'll get into that. But before we start, I have a picture. I don't know if everybody here online, you can see it. I'll kind of turn it for everybody here. Anybody know who that is? I can't get rid of the green box, so I apologize.
You can hide the thing if you want.
It's
On the the drop down menu. I think.
It's
It's
green.
definitely green.
There we go.
Oh, Achilles.
Achilles.
Oh.
What gave it away?
Greek armor. He's in a bow pose. The flip. I mean, I was just assumed.
Okay.
the heel.
Ah, it's hard to see. You guys still see it online? Are we still online? Are you guys still there?
Abu, now it's black.
It's black. Fantastic.
Yeah, mine went out too.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. Some of you see it, some of you don't. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop sharing and share it one more time, and then get your Bibles. So Achilles. So what's the story as I'm pulling this out? What's the story of the Greek god Achilles?
Other. From his heel, right? Over sticks. Right?
Yeah. Wow, that's impressive.
It's a Greek mythology. Six. Maybe of six. It was a river indeed.
No, it's a river Styx, right? A river Styx. So, sorry, guys, I can't show the slides. It's causing Zoom to crash. So anyway, so the story of Achilles, who was a Greek god, is that his mother held him and dipped him in this river that made him, invincible, so to speak. But she dipped him by his heel so that there would be a part of him that would be vulnerable, right? And as the story goes, and I don't want to get too much into it, is that he was in this battle, the Battle of Troy, right, which is Trojan horse, and in that battle he gets shot with an arrow in his heel, and as a result he dies, right? So that's the Greek god Achilles. But I shared the whole thing was to get to the point of Achilles heel, right? Because Achilles heel, that terminology or that metaphor came from this story, right? And everybody, like we use that term Achilles heel to describe some sort of vulnerability, right? And everybody's got an Achilles, right? Everybody's got an Achilles. So kind of first question to kind of get us warmed up is, what's your Achilles heel? and I will share mine. So my Achilles heel is I was born without a gene that allows for appropriate time management. I was like, genetic malformation is this? So I feel like I have a gene that where I struggle to budget time, right? And like in our marriage, this is a frequent point of tension where I think that we can do like 5-6 things like in a row and not have any lapses in turnaround time, even though we have 3 kids and like stuff happens all the time.
Sure.
Right. So yeah, that is my Achilles heel, and it affects me at home, it affects me here at church and in different plans. So it's definitely an Achilles heel, right? And it's a cyclical pattern. It's not like, oh, I really messed up, I totally learned my lesson, I'll budget time better. No, I still sink it, right? So it is Achilles heel. What's your Achilles heel?
I have no memory.
I have perfect.
I have no memory. So that's why we missed last week, huh? All right. Yeah.
A negative mindset. Something.
Can have a negative mindset.
Overthinking.
So they overanalyze.
My height.
Is
I'm serious.
that what the poll said?
Actually, yes.
Overly cautious.
Actually, yes.
So overly cautious. Huh? Anybody online got any Achilles heels that they care to share?
Yeah, I have one. My name can be. I have CP.
Say that one more time, George.
My name can be. I have C body. CEO. CEO. EBASLY.
Oh, you're sleepy.
No,
Sorry.
CP.
Did you type it in the chat?
Yeah,
All right. Thanks.
sorry.
Anybody else? Achilles heel. If you're brave enough to share it, kind of my follow-up question is like I want you to kind of think about the frustration that you end up dealing with because of your Achilles heel, right? Because it all paralyzes us in some way or another, right? And we have to deal with it over and over. And definitely our Achilles heel affects those around us, like our friends, our family, our loved ones, like our Achilles heel affects them. Now I want you to kind of flip it and be like, think of somebody who is close to you, right? Who you know their Achilles heel, right? What is it like to deal with their Achilles heel?
Tiring.
Tiring.
Getting on my nerves.
It gets on my nerves.
Maddening.
Huh?
Maddening.
Maddening. It's also like bewildering because sometimes you're like, we've talked about this and you're still doing it, right? So it's like hard to wrap your mind around like, what's wrong with them?
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of the last like question I'll leave you with, but you don't you don't have to answer, but just kind of maybe soak on it, is kind of along that same lines. I'm sure somebody at some point has given you advice about your Achilles heel, right? About whatever it is you struggle with. And for sure, like none of us probably listened from the first time, to it. And it led to consequences, right? And sometimes these consequences haunt us for years, right? It's not like a one and done or a specific event, but sometimes the consequences we endure from not listening to those who have reflected back to us, like what our Achilles heel is, right? And taken their advice to do something corrective, have let us, lose years sometimes or lose relationships as a result of this, right? And we spend years trying to recover. That's what I want us to kind of keep in mind as we begin to dive into Judges. Because Judges, we're going to look at a time period in which, okay, there was advice given, it wasn't taken, and they would not spend years, but they would spend decades, like struggling to overcome, this Achilles heel that the children of Israel has, right? That's where I want us to think about. So we're going to kind of take that and jump into Judges. And to kind of start off, right, we'll kind of get out of the way. It's not a big, thing for us to discuss much about is, okay, so who wrote Judges, right? And it's, when we look at the text itself, it's considered anonymous. So we don't actually know who wrote it. It is thought that Samuel wrote it, but there are some parts in Judges that speak of the time of the kings, and which tends to indicate that this book was probably written many years afterwards, probably even around the time of David, right? Which Samuel was around, but it probably extended beyond, Samuel's life. And so Samuel may have written part of it, and then others have added in as well. But they attributed it to Samuel because whenever you have an anonymous book, right, it always helped to tag somebody who is well known or holy, right, to the book. But academically speaking, could be Samuel, likely other people who have written the book, right? And it was definitely written after the time of the Judges, right? When we look at this book, there are categories of books within the Old Testament. Anybody know what the categories are? History, okay, historical books, poetry books, huh? Major and minor prophets.
Five Moses.
The 5 books of Moses. That one has a couple names.
Books, right?
No, it's not the Dinner Chronicle. It's called
Torah?
Pentateuch. What else? The law. Books of law or the Torah, right? So those, like when we talk about first five books, those are the different names that can be used to describe those first 5 books, right? So Judges, it falls into that category of historical books, right? Put the context of Judges, right? Let's kind of like do a quick timeline. We'll pick it up from Moses, right? Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, right? In the beginning of Exodus, and then they went to the Promised Land, and they sent out the spies, and there were 12 spies, which 2 came back and said yes we can, and which and we don't know the names of the 10. So which 2 came back and said yes we can take the Promised Land? Joshua and Caleb, right? The other 10 said no, we can't do it. That propelled them into 40 years in the wilderness, kind of purifying the Israelites from a generation of people who just didn't think that they can, God would come through on his promise. Also in that time, what we have is this covenantal relationship with the Israelites, right? And I'll read the verses. It's from Exodus 19, 5 and 6, where God is really beginning this relationship with the Israelites. Okay. And Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, it says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel," right? And that covenant, Moses was kind of the middle person who was, if you will, coordinating these efforts between God and the people and the covenant, right? And pretty much it was God gave them these rules, right, or the 10 Commandments in which to live by, and as long as they would do that, as long as they would abide by the infrastructure, that God was setting up, God would bless them. And if they didn't, if they began to violate, then there would be punishment. They would violate the covenant. But as long as they committed to the covenant, God would continue to look over them and bless them, right? And so we spent 40 years in the wilderness, and then as we finally finish that 40 years, Joshua and Caleb come in, or they last through the wilderness, 40 years in the wilderness, and then they go and they cross the Jordan. And what's the first battle? Jericho, right? And these battles, these initial battles that Joshua and Caleb are fighting to begin the conquest of the promised land are oftentimes referred to as the Canaanite Wars, right? And the Canaanite Wars, deserve a lot of discussion because a lot of people can kind of hear about the Canaanite Wars and come away with like questions about God, because these Canaanite Wars have a lot of language that talk about, and God told them to go and annihilate everyone and to wipe out the men, women, and children, right? So there's tough language in the Bible with regards to the Canaanite Wars, right? And we can spend more time, we will kind of touch on it a little bit more, but there are answers to those. And I think they're good answers, but also like the whole Canaanite War is a difficult topic, all right? So I'm not going to shy away from that. We're not going to devote all the time that we need for it. But I just want you to be aware of it, that this is around the time. So Joshua and Caleb begin the initial conquest of the promised land. And then in the end of last couple of chapters of Joshua, what we see is that of the 12 tribes, they're breaking up the promised land, right? And the promised land is about 150 to 200 miles in from north to south and about 50 miles wide, right? So that's roughly the size of the promised land. And they divided them up amongst the tribes. And each tribe is supposed to go to their area and essentially take the land, right? Because the Canaanites, they live there. And the Canaanites are a composition of different towns and villages, different idol worship and pagan backgrounds and all these. So it's a huge mix of land, right? And each tribe was supposed to go to the area and take it over. But in Joshua's parting words, right, he says this to the children of Israel. And we're going to read from Joshua 24, verses 14 through 16. Joshua 24, 14 through 16. And he says, "Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord." Right, this is an important part. "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the God of the Amorites, in whose lands you dwell. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Right? Then the people answered and said, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods." So Joshua gave them, he said, okay, we're going, all right, we're here, make a decision. What are you going to do? Either commit to serving God, but if you see it as evil, at least admit it now and go your way. Do whatever you want. But if you're going to go forward convicted. Right? And that's what really brings us into the Judges, because in the beginning, in the opening chapters of the book of the Judges, all right, it revolves around, okay, how did they actually respond to this challenge by Joshua, right, to really make a decision? And what we're going to see in the first chapter, which we're not going to read, I'll mostly share about, is that the Israelites committed to this, and in response to it, they were told to go and take the land. But in that process of taking the land, you got to bring down all the idols, all the temples, and rid the land of the Canaanites. Why do you think God wanted them to rid the land? Right? It seems harsh. Right? It seems harsh. But why give such a strong, command to go and rid the land of the idols and the different pagan gods and the people itself?
I mean, I feel like any small reminder, any remnants will like easily bring them back away from God and like back into whatever is in.
Absolutely. You're right. Like, God saw his people as weak. They were still growing in their relationship with him. Right? And this is like, yeah, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. It wasn't, cupcakes and cherries while they were there. Like, there are a lot of mistakes. And now he's giving them the land, and they're young, they're struggling, and he knows them because they're his child, and they know that they can easily be influenced by those around. So that's why he's giving like some strong advice, right? Which is why I had us all kind of think of that question, like, what is advice that you got that pertained to your Achilles heel that you actually didn't follow? Right? It was probably strong advice, and it was much needed advice, but we faltered to follow it. And then we would pay for it in the years to come. Right? And so they went in and they struggled. They were still weak nation. They could have done it together, but they kind of piecemealed their efforts, if you will, and they couldn't drive everybody out. And what they started to do is make agreements saying like, okay, well, you can stay here, but you're going to pay taxes. So now they started to make a little bit of finances off, right? And some of them couldn't charge, couldn't overtake. And so they actually lived on the outskirts in some tribes, and they feared the inhabitants. So there was different dynamics going around, all right, within the different tribes, right? And God responded to their violation of his command to go and clear out them, right? And this is where we're going to jump into Judges. We'll look at Judges chapter 2. And can somebody read Judges 2, verses 1 through 3?
Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal and Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I'll never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you.
So we're really setting the stage for what is going to happen in this book, right? And it's really highlighted where the Lord said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be a thorn in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. Right? So we're seeing like this imagery of a thorn and a snare is something that happens over and over and over. Right? So let's continue. Let's read. We'll jump down to verses 11, and we'll read 11 through 23. It's a large section, so read it loud and slow. But 11 through 23. And I want you to kind of think about like, okay, well, what's happened? What's the pattern?
Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baal. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. So he delivered them into the hands of the plunderers who despoiled them. And he sold them into their hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers, by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doing, nor from their stubborn way. Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hands of Joshua.
Right. So, right. What's the cycle? Didn't listen.
I send people to punishment.
God used the surrounding people, like the inhabitants, the Canaanites, to punish them.
They revert for a little bit.
They what? Sorry?
They revert back to like the good path for a little bit.
Not yet. What happens?
They worship another god.
Sorry?
They worship another.
So that's part of the deviation. So they deviate, and the ways that they deviate is they would, it said here like Baals and Ashtoreths. So when he uses that, Baal was a pagan god. When the Bible uses and says Baals, right, it's a reference to, it's kind of a catch-all phrase of all the different pagan gods in the area, right? So Baal wasn't the only one. It was a reference to all of them. The Ashtoreths specifically, they were that was a female goddess. So Baal was a male goddess, and Ashtoreth was a female goddess. She was a female goddess of fertility, and kind of along with that package was a lot of sexual immorality, ritualized prostitution, kind of within this land, like there was child sacrifice. The Canaanites were known for child sacrifice. So Canaan was an ugly place, right? It was an ugly place, right? So the deviation came in the participation of all that, right? Or the incorporation of elements into what they were doing, right? And so they would deviate. And then we said that God would use them to use the surrounding Canaanites and the different, groups that comprise Canaan to punish them. Then what would happen?
They'd be in distress.
They would be in distress.
Because
They would pray. Okay.
Bring the judges out?
then God would raise a judge, right? And what would the judge do?
Guide them back.
Okay.
Mm.
Sort of guide them.
Beat the foreign nation.
All right, so he would deliver them. He would be a deliverer. Okay. And how long would that last?
Until the judge died.
Until the judge died, right? So just a little bit of time and then repeat, right? So every time we talk about a judge, right, we've gone through this cycle, right? Deviate, punish, pray, judge, we're good, repeat, right? That's the cycle of the book, right? It's an ugly cycle, right? It's a sad cycle. But based on that, how would you describe a judge? What kind of person was a judge? Sort of, but other than one judge in the book, they actually didn't sit there and mediate like legal matters, right?
Righteous.
They were warriors. They definitely weren't righteous. We will see that.
Oh, sure.
Right. We will see. Wait till I get to Samson, all right? But a judge in this context was a military leader of sorts, because they would go and they would fight a battle, they would kill the king, they would kill the local ruler, almost sometimes like murdering hundreds at a time, if not thousands, in order to bring like reprieve to the children of Israel. That's who a judge was. Like, we think judge and we're like, okay, like somebody who kind of heard the problems and decided what was right and wrong. That wasn't a judge, right? Only one, Deborah, kind of did that, but the rest were essentially military leaders that had a bit of pizzazz to them, right? That God called and kind of set forth to go and bring reprieve. And when you think of this, like, there's things that are hard to kind of stomach, like, okay, God is like raising up people in order to kill off like the other king or the other ruler, and then hundreds of their army in order to bring peace. Like, it's unsettling, right? And that's something that we have to try and reconcile. Is this the same God? Is this the same God that we're talking about, who is also in the New Testament, who clearly is giving us a whole different set of morality to live by, right? Doing this in the New Testament didn't fit, right? And one of the arguments people will say is like, okay, well, it was the God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament, but that doesn't make sense, right? It is God. But we have to appreciate, like, what was he dealing with, right? This was a barbaric time, right? Look at the land of Canaan and child sacrifice, ritualistic prostitution, like so many ugly things. And these were people who, this is like all they can understand, right? Is this sort of society. And so with what he had, right, he used to the best of the ability of the people, right? It wasn't pretty, but this is what it was, right? This was the time that they're in. And the one thing that I think is helpful is, remember in the New Testament where Jesus was questioned about divorce. And he said, it's not permitted. It was only permitted back then. Why? Because of the hardness of your heart. Because that's what they could do, right? Going much further than that it was too mind-blowing for the people at the time. So settling wars peacefully or disputes peacefully was beyond what the people could comprehend, right? So this was the society that we're living in at this time,
I
right?
have a question.
Yeah.
Did the people know that the judges came from the Lord, or was it just a military leader that rose up to power?
Which people are you referring to?
Israelites.
The Israelites, yeah. Because like, and we'll see it, like there's, if you will, like a cadence or literary style that we'll see is that, and the Lord raised up this judge, right? And the Lord blessed this judge with, gave them this ability or so on.
Yeah, but we're
So-
talking about that from the context of like posterity, someone afterwards. I'm talking about the people at the time, they know that this judge came from the Lord itself, or was it just someone who happened to have military success?
No, because when you look at the situations, like the children of Israel were in the dumps every time a judge arose.
Sure.
So there's nobody who had military success from the Israelites. And a lot of the times, like you'll see that, especially next week when we look at Gideon, like, yes, he was called a mighty man of valor, but he was like doing things on the side, just trying to be unnoticed, right? So he didn't have military success, but the way the Lord brought him and kind of pushed him into the scene and put him at the forefront and gave him command of those who would follow, like it was clearly from the Lord. And how he won, it was clearly from the Lord. Right. And you'll see that next. Right. I mean, Gideon is a really good example, but in all these people, like, yes, they may have had presence, but in every situation that God was raising up a judge, it's because they were like scared, tired, beat down, and really spread thin.
When something
Yeah.
about feeling that people, so they had an ugly practice, not an ugly practice, but in the current era, anyone who kills someone, nevertheless his own kid, he would face death penalty, of course.
Mhm.
So it wasn't hard that at that time there wasn't a civil law that will
Mhm.
judge them. So killing them will stop that practice to spread among many people. And this is God's justice because they are not human. It's not a kind of morality or higher morality, but they are acting against their own human nature that protect their kids is kind of their own built-in behavior.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and maybe even to answer that, like, or to add to that, is that there was an expectation that God had of humanity, even though it's ugly, right? There and what we're looking at is a bit barbaric, but there was an expectation, right? There was an expectation that that a mother and a father would know not to sacrifice a child, right? So even when you look at ourselves, like, we can piece together a degree of morality, right? We sense it, we know it. And if you've ever actually been around like kids, like, it's surprising how when they stumble across a new situation, they have a sense of like what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong, right? And so it is built in us. But the people that we're looking at, especially the Canaanites, like, they were deliberately going against it. And God was punishing that sin. And the way he was punishing that sin was he was raising up also the Israelites to say, okay, go and wipe this out. So there was punishment that. But just so that we don't think that God was partial, to the Israelites, he kind of used the same standard, because when the Israelites were acting sinfully, what did he do? He used other nations to punish them, right? What God hated was the sin. And he would raise up people or nations to come down on the sin. And if that meant coming down on his own, he was going to come down on his own, because God is a just God and sin is sin. Whether it's a nation or his own people committing it, sin is sin. Right. So we see that at play also, throughout this book. All right. How we all doing? Any questions? Those are good questions, good points. All right, we're going to take on 3 judges, all right, 3 of the most well-known judges in the book: Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Okay, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. We're going to look at Deborah. Like, her story is short; it's 1 chapter, and it's not like a complex story. And her story picks up in chapter 4. Right. So Deborah is the only female judge in this book. And she comes after, as we see in verse 1 here, after this judge Ehud. And Ehud was really interesting, like the Lord raised him up and, to kill the king who was oppressing the Israelites at the time. And the story is kind of like, it's an odd one where Ehud was left-handed. And so he tied a sword to his right thigh, right? Gotcha. Tied a sword to his right thigh and somehow got into the king's private quarters. And the king was so fat that he took the sword, shoved it in, and to the point where the whole sword like disappeared inside the king, right? And then he died and he ran away, and that's how the Israelites were freed. But these are the stories that's in the Judges. So that's Ehud, right? We're not going to really meditate on that much beyond that, right? But he was a judge, and then after he died, what we see in verse 1 is the cycle repeating. So if somebody can read verses 1 through 7 of chapter 4.
When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them in the hands of Japin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Haggayim. The children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time, and she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountain of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. And she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abunam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. And she said to him, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded? Go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Japin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hands.
All right, great. So it's very strange that in a very patriarchal and male-driven society that we have a woman judge, right? And not just a judge, but also a prophetess, right? And she's clearly she's actually depicted in a very nice way, right? We don't get a sense that there's like any big flaw, as we're going to see like with the other judges, right? And she's there and she clearly has the respect. And she's actually the only judge, as I was saying earlier, who was judging Israel at the time. So people were coming to her, like talking about issues, and she was, imparting her wisdom on them and helping themselves. So she gained this, if you will, like authority and respect from the people. And to have that, authority and respect is clearly like God elevating her, giving her that ability to be a prophet, right? But God speaks to her and says, okay, like I heard the cries of the Israelites, and I know Sisera is mean and ugly, so now it's time, right? And call for Barak, the son of Abinoam, and let's tell him to go, right? So we begin to see this, orchestration of Israel's release from the King of Kings. And actually, St. John Chrysostom said something very nice in his commentary on this with regards to Deborah, right? Now, I'll read this quote from him because I think it speaks to how strong of a woman that she is. Indeed, nothing, I repeat, is more potent than a good and prudent woman in molding a man and shaping his soul in whatever way she desires. For he will not bear with friends or teachers or magistrates in the same way as with his wife when she admonishes and advises him, right? Even John Chrysostom paints this picture of Deborah having like men just as like putty in her hands, right? And it tells us a little bit about her character, right? And that she was a strong woman, right? And that she was well respected, and people took what she said seriously, right? But in the verse, to come, verses 8 and 9, we get to the crux of this story, right? So she called Barak and says, "This is what the Lord is telling us to do, and I want you to do it. And don't worry, even though he's got all these chariots, the Lord is going to deliver him into your hands," right? Somebody read verses 8 and 9.
And
And
Barak
Barak said to her, "If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." So she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh.
All right. So it definitely wasn't the custom for women to go to battle. For Barak to say that I'm not going unless you're there, again speaks to her character, speaks to her strength, speaks to the presence or how she affects the atmosphere in any situation. Right? For him to say, "Okay, this is a big battle. I'm not going unless you're there." Right? Goes against every social norm at the time. And Deborah responds and says, "Okay, I'll go," right? Her confidence clearly stemming from God, who said, "I'm going to deliver them into your hands." Right? So there's a confidence. I think one of the nice points, like right here, and one of my personal take-home points, is that when there's a confidence in our calling, right, and a confidence in our mission, with that comes the strength and the courage to break social norms. Right? When we have a confidence in our calling, in our mission, and in our relationship with God, it gives us the strength and the courage that we need to break social norms. Right? Social norms should have kept Deborah on the side, but she broke it. Right? She went against it. Not because she was arrogant, but she was confident in what God was doing and what God was orchestrating. Right? How many of us in different situations want to speak something, want to say something, or do something different? But the social pressures quiet us. We don't know how it's going to be received. We don't know what the recoil will be. We don't know if there will be consequences. We don't want to break the protocol. But when there's an understanding in our relationship with God, when there's a confidence stemming from it, right? We can go beyond. Right? We can go beyond, and we can trust that God will orchestrate it appropriately. I think it's a really it's one of my favorite points with Deborah, because it's a reminder to me, in all these situations where I pull back because I don't know how it will be perceived, right? And I think that has a lot to do with my own security in who God is calling me to be. All right. Let's look at verses 14. And we're going to do 14 through 23, which is the end of the chapter. All right. 14 through 23. Finish off this. So Deborah is saying she's going to go. And in the verses between 9 and 14, essentially, Barak is gathering all the troops and bringing everybody together. And then they're going to go out and fight the battle. Right. And then 14 is where we pick it up.
And Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Agoim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, and not a man was left. However, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not fear." And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Then he said to her, "Please give me a little to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is there any man here?' you shall say no." Then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. And then, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man whom you seek." And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera, dead with the peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel.
Surprise ending. Didn't see that one coming, right? But this is the time that we live in, right? And it, Sisera got surprised because he thought he was, taking, refuge with an ally, and the ally turned against him. And Barak, too, like he kind of comes into this picture, and while he fought the battle, like the key part to the battle is when the one leader kills the other, right? And Barak, for whatever reasons, like, he was robbed of that, or not really robbed of that. He deprived himself of that because he struggled to hear what Deborah was saying and believe it and trust, right? And when you kind of compare these two characters between Deborah and Barak, right? How would you compare these two? Because this is the last lesson that I wanted to kind of cipher. But if you were to describe Barak and describe Deborah, who we spent a little time doing, how would you look at these two?
Deborah was more confident.
Deborah's definitely more confident.
The prayer, one is the doer.
I'm sorry, say that again?
She's like the prayer, he's the one that does the actions.
Okay. She was prayerful. He was doing. What else?
He has trust in the Lord and his promises.
She definitely exhibited a degree of trust that Barak did not have. Not that, like, I wouldn't call him untrustworthy, but it's clear to see that her trust in the Lord was far greater than Barak. Agreed. I would kind of add to that, like, there was courage, but there was a lot more courage, with Deborah, right? And I think if we keep on going through it, like, we'll find similar characteristics in both. You can say, okay, both courageous, they both went to war, right? Both were trusting, but clearly one had more. Which is important because it gives us a picture of how these virtues or these characteristics that we highlight or emulate in people are on a continuum, right? And there's kind of the beginning point of it, and then there's the growth of it, right? And when we look in this story, like, it's not that Barak did anything wrong, but he missed out on opportunity, and he missed out on blessing, and and blessing, and contextualizing that blessing back then. Right? The blessing of killing the other leader, right? That was a blessing, right? Back then. Right? But he missed that because he was still like struggling, he was growing, right? Deborah got it or experienced it because she was a bit more advanced. And when you look at these two, like, I think we can probably safely assume that Deborah clearly had this relationship with God that Barak did not. And when you look at Barak, he was, if you will, like in the everyday mess of society at that time. And that everyday mess, again, like it chips away at these characteristics. It chips away at our ability to grow in these virtues, grow in these, desirable characteristics of trust and courage, boldness, and all these things, right? And it's the challenge is for us to look and say, like, okay, in what ways am I, if you will, just meddling with society to the point where it's eroding my ability or slowing my abilities, maybe a better way of saying it, slowing my ability to grow in trust or to grow in courage or to break social norms, right? And I think that's a beautiful picture between Deborah and Barak, right? You see somebody who is clearly closer to God, was doing his work and what she was able to do in the story, and Barak, who's still good, but missed out, clearly missed, right? And when we don't take that advice, right, which is the advice of this book of like, be careful of our surroundings, be careful of what we allow to be in our lives, because it is a snare and it is a thorn. In what ways? Oh, we miss the blessing that God is bringing to us. We struggle in that ability to trust. We struggle in being courageous when we allow the thorns to remain in our lives. Right? Everybody has a different thorn, and everybody has a different Achilles heel, right? And it's always just kind of like robbing us of different opportunities. Any last questions? 9 o'clock.
Hey, I'll put more music inside.
Yeah, I see that, George. Thank you, man, for sharing.
Yeah.
All right, let's close in prayer. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. We thank you, Lord, for your blessings. We thank you for this day. And we thank you for this example of the judges. Lord, help us to look, to learn, to glean from it, to challenge ourselves in our own lives, to heed words of wisdom that come to each of our lives. And while the words and the advice are difficult, they would take a lot of energy from us, Lord. They do spare us from years of struggling with things. So we thank you, Lord, that you continue to be faithful to us as you were faithful to the Israelites, and you continue to pursue after them. And though they violated the covenant, you did not violate. And you do so the same with us. We thank you, Lord, for your faithfulness to us, your desire for us to learn and to grow throughout our lives. Through the intercession of all your saints here, so as we say, our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. Righteous are you, for thy is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory.